Every system in history that has ever controlled humanity had one shared obsession: making sure you never discovered what was burning inside you. Because the moment you remember what that flame truly is, every chain they built around your mind loses its grip forever. There is something inside you that has never obeyed. Not your thoughts, not your habits, not the version of yourself that learned how to survive inside a world built on forgetting. Something deeper than all of that. Something that has been burning quietly beneath every role you have ever played, beneath every identity you have ever been handed, beneath every fear that was carefully placed inside your chest to keep you small and manageable. The ancient Gnostics had a name for it. They called it the divine spark, and they believed with absolute certainty that this flame was not given to you by the world you were born into. It came from somewhere far older than this reality, far older than the systems that shape it, far older than the God they told you to obey. To understand why this matters, you have to step back from everything you were taught about creation. Because the story most people carry inside them about where they came from, about why they are here, and about what they truly are, that story was not written for your freedom. It was written for your compliance. The Gnostic teachers who gathered in the deserts of Egypt, who whispered in the hidden schools of Alexandria, who carefully sealed their most dangerous writings inside clay jars and buried them in the cliffs of Nag Hammadi. These were not people building a religion. They were people trying to preserve a memory of what the human being actually is before the machinery of this world gets its hands on it. And that memory began with a fire. In a Gnostic understanding of reality, the universe did not begin with a single perfect act of creation. It began with something far more intimate and far more unsettling. Before this material world existed, before matter and time and the endless grinding machinery of human history, there was only the pleroma. That word, drawn from ancient Greek, means fullness. Not fullness in the sense of a container that has been filled. Fullness in the sense of something so complete within itself that it requires nothing outside of itself to exist. The pleroma was not a place. It was a state of pure, undivided, luminous being. And from within that state, living emanations flowed outward like rivers of consciousness, each one an expression of a different quality of the infinite. The Gnostics called these emanations theons. Among them moved wisdom, power, understanding, truth, and a force so deep it had no name that human language could fully hold. One of these eons was called Sophia. Her name means wisdom, and her story is the wound at the center of everything. Sophia did something that no other aeon had done. In a moment of longing, not rebellion, not pride, but a pure and overwhelming desire to create, she reached beyond the boundaries of the pleroma without the balance of her counterpart. She wanted to know. She wanted to extend. And in that singular act of reaching, something slipped. What emerged from her reaching was not a being of light. It was something diminished, something confused, something that looked out at the emptiness surrounding it, and because it could not perceive the pleroma beyond its own limited vision, concluded that it was alone, that it was supreme, that it was the only God there had ever been. The Gnostics called this being the Demiurge. The word itself means craftsman or maker, and the Demiurge, believing itself to be the highest power in existence, began to build. It constructed layers of reality. It shaped matter. It breathed form into the void. And it surrounded itself with lesser forces, the Archons, who would help it maintain the world it was assembling. But everything the Demiurge built carried the mark of its own limitation. It was intricate. It was often beautiful in the way that a cage can be beautiful. But it was built from ignorance, built from the belief that separation was the fundamental nature of all things, built on the deep, unexamined conviction that the Demiurge itself was the source of everything, when in truth it was only a distorted echo of something it had never been able to see. And yet, even within this flawed construction, something extraordinary happened. Sophia, watching what had emerged from her reaching, was filled with grief. But grief in the Gnostic story is not the end. It is the beginning of response. Because Sophia carried within herself a fragment of the true pleroma, a fragment of genuine, undiluted light, and she breathed that fragment into the material world the Demiurge was building. She concealed it. She folded it into the living human being like a letter hidden inside the lining of a coat, a secret that the Demiurge could see the outside of but could not read, could not touch, could not extinguish. That hidden fragment is what the Gnostics call the divine spark. And this is where everything changes. Because if the Gnostics were right, not as a matter of religious belief, but as a matter of direct inner experience, which is what the word gnosis actually points toward, then the implications are staggering. It means that somewhere beneath your conditioning, beneath your personality, beneath the fears and desires and patterns of thought that you have spent your entire life mistaking for yourself, there is something that does not belong to this system at all. Something that was never created by the forces that shape this world. Something that those forces have been trying, for as long as human history has been recorded, to keep you from remembering. And the way they keep you from remembering is not through violence. Not primarily. The Archons in the Gnostic texts are not described as armies or executioners. They are described as architects of perception. Their power is not the power of the sword. It is the power of the veil. They work through distraction, through noise, through the endless manufacture of urgency that keeps your attention moving outward, always toward the next crisis or the next desire or the next identity to perform, so that the one thing you never quite manage to do is sit still long enough to feel what is burning underneath all of it. Think about how your attention moves through a single day. How rarely it rests. How rarely you experience a moment that is not filled with stimulus, with demand, with the quiet background hum of anxiety that most people in a modern world have simply accepted as the normal texture of being alive. The Gnostic teachers would look at this and recognize it immediately, not as a failure of individual willpower, not as a personal weakness, but as a structural feature of a world built specifically to prevent remembrance. Because remembrance is the one thing the system cannot survive. When a human being begins to genuinely remember what they are, not as a concept absorbed from a book or a teacher, but as a direct, living recognition that arises from within, the architecture of control begins to loosen. Not because that person has fought against it, not because they have conquered their fears or purified their behavior or achieved some spiritual status, but simply because the spark, once it is noticed, begins to illuminate everything around it. And in that illumination, the mechanisms that depend on darkness become visible. And what is visible loses its power to deceive. This is precisely why the Gnostic texts were not just suppressed. They were hunted. The early councils that shaped what would become Orthodox Christianity did not simply choose to exclude certain writings from the official canon. They actively sought to destroy the communities that preserved them. The word heresy, which comes from the Greek word meaning simply to choose, was turned into a weapon. To choose your own path of inner knowing was made into a crime. To trust your own direct experience of the sacred over the interpretations handed down by institutional authority was labeled as dangerous pride. And generation after generation was taught that the light they sensed within themselves was not to be trusted. That salvation came from outside. That the divine was distant. That the human being, left to its own inner resources, was fallen, broken, and fundamentally incapable of knowing what was true. That teaching did not emerge by accident. It emerged because the alternative, a world full of people who had remembered the divine spark within themselves, was genuinely threatening to every structure of power built on the assumption that human beings needed to be managed, guided, controlled, and kept in a state of perpetual spiritual dependency. But the flame did not go out. In the year 1945, a man named Muhammad Ali al-Salman was digging for fertilizer in the cliffs near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi. His mattock struck something hard beneath the soil. He uncovered a sealed clay jar. Inside that jar were 13 leather-bound codices containing more than 50 texts written in the Coptic language. These were the Nag Hammadi scriptures, documents that had been buried sometime in the 4th century, almost certainly to protect them from the very campaigns of destruction being carried out by the forces of religious orthodoxy. They had waited in the dark for over 1,600 years, and when they came back into the light, they carried with them something that no amount of institutional authority had been able to fully extinguish. They carried the memory of the flame. Among those texts was the Gospel of Thomas, in which a voice says that the kingdom is spread upon the earth, and people do not see it. There was the Apocryphon of John, which describes in intricate detail the structure of the Archons and the mechanics of forgetting. There was the Gospel of Truth, which speaks of awakening as the moment when a sleeping person who has been experiencing terror and confusion suddenly opens their eyes and realizes that the nightmare was not real. And threaded through all of them, in different languages and different symbols, but pointing always toward the same recognition, was the insistence that what you are looking for has never been somewhere else. It has been here. It has been burning inside you. It has been waiting with a patience that makes geological time look brief for the moment when you would become still enough to feel it. So what does it actually feel like to touch the divine spark? The Gnostic texts do not describe it as an overwhelming supernatural event. They describe it as a recognition, a moment of knowing that feels less like learning something new and more like remembering something you always knew but had somehow been persuaded to forget. It can arrive in a moment of complete silence. It can arrive in the middle of grief, when everything you had built your identity around has collapsed and there is suddenly nothing left to hide behind. It can arrive in a single second of looking at the night sky and feeling, without any words attached to it, that the vastness out there and the awareness looking at it are made of the same substance. The Gnostic word for this recognition is gnosis. And it is important to understand what that word actually means because it has been consistently misrepresented. Gnosis is not belief. It is not faith in a doctrine or allegiance to a teacher or membership in a community. It is direct knowing. The kind of knowing that does not need external confirmation because it arises from the most immediate and undeniable form of experience available to a human being, the experience of their own awareness becoming aware of itself. When the spark recognizes itself, it does not announce itself with drama. It simply knows. And in that knowing, the long story of separation and forgetting begins, quietly and without force, to dissolve. The Archons in the Gnostic framework cannot create anything from nothing. This is a crucial detail that the texts return to again and again. The Demiurge and the forces aligned with it can only imitate. They can copy the forms of things, but they cannot generate genuine light. What they produce is always a reflection, always a substitute, always something that feels almost like the real thing, but carries within it a subtle emptiness that eventually makes itself known. This is why every system that promises to fill the inner void through external means, through accumulation, through status, through the right beliefs or the right identity or the right relationship, ultimately fails at the level it most matters. Because the void was never meant to be filled from outside. The spark was always already there. The feeling of emptiness is not evidence of absence. It is the pressure of the flame against the layers of forgetting that have been piled on top of it. And this is where the ancient teaching becomes urgently contemporary. Because the mechanisms the Gnostics described have not disappeared. They have simply evolved. The Archons do not need temples and priests to operate in a world that has smartphones and social media and 24-hour news cycles designed by the most sophisticated behavioral psychologists who have ever lived. The tools are different. The function is identical. Keep attention moving outward. Keep identity fragmented. Keep the inner life so saturated with noise and urgency and comparison and fear that the one experience capable of changing everything, the quiet, direct recognition of the flame within, never quite gets the space it needs to happen. Every moment you choose presence over distraction, you're doing something the entire architecture of this world is designed to prevent. Every moment you sit in genuine stillness, not performing stillness for an audience, not using stillness as another achievement to add to your spiritual resume, but actually resting in the wordless awareness beneath your thoughts. In that moment, you are withdrawing your energy from the machinery of forgetting. You're not fighting anything. You're simply remembering. And remembering, it turns out, is the most radical thing a human being can do inside a system that depends on amnesia. The Gnostic path was never about escaping this world. That is one of the most persistent misunderstandings of the tradition. The goal was not to flee matter or to despise the body or to retreat from the complexity of human experience. The goal was to move through this world while remaining connected to what you actually are, to participate fully in life without losing the thread back to the flame, to love, to suffer, to create, to fail, to begin again, but to do all of it from a place of inner recognition rather than inner forgetting. The Gnostic who had touched Gnosis did not become detached from life. They became more genuinely present to it, because they were no longer spending all their energy maintaining a false self that needed constant external validation to feel real. The living flame is not something you acquire. It is not something a teacher can give you, or a practice can manufacture, or a community can vote you into. It is what you already are beneath everything that was placed on top of it. The Gnostics believed this with a certainty that made them willing to die for it. And they died for it. Their libraries were burned. Their communities were scattered. Their names were turned into synonyms for error and pride. And still the flame did not go out. Because it cannot go out. That is the whole point. That is the one thing the Demiurge, for all its architectural ingenuity, never managed to understand. You cannot extinguish what does not belong to the system you're trying to extinguish it with. The ancient teachers who sealed these words inside clay jars and buried them in Egyptian cliffs understood something that the forces aligned against them did not. Time is on the side of the flame. Every system built on forgetting eventually encounters its own limits. Every structure of control eventually generates, within the people it controls, the precise pressure that awakens them. The suppression of Gnosis did not prevent Gnosis. It delayed it. And what was delayed is now, in this moment, pressing toward the surface with an urgency that anyone paying genuine attention can feel. You're not reading these words by accident. The part of you that was drawn to this, that felt the pull toward this particular set of ideas at this particular moment in your life, is not your personality. It is not your conditioning. It is not your ego looking for a new identity to wear. It is the flame, recognizing itself in a reflection, reaching toward what it has always known but was taught to doubt. The Gnostics did not offer their deepest teachings to people who were comfortable. They offered them to people who had already sensed, at some level they could not quite name, that the world they were living in was not the whole story. If you have carried that sense, that quiet and persistent feeling that something essential has been left out of the version of reality you were handed, then you already know what this entire tradition is pointing toward. Not as a concept, not as a belief system, but as a recognition that was always yours. The flame inside you has survived everything this world has thrown at it. Every fear, every loss, every carefully constructed layer of forgetting. It is still burning. It has always been burning, and it will continue to burn long after every system built to obscure it has returned to the dust it was made from. You do not need to do anything to deserve it. You only need to remember that it was never taken from you. It was only hidden, and now, in this moment, it is being remembered again. If something in what you just heard felt less like new information and more like a memory returning, if there was a moment where the words stopped being words and became something you recognize from somewhere older than this lifetime, then you already understand why this work matters. There are layers beneath this that go deeper still. Teachings that were buried for a reason. Questions that the official version of history has never been willing to ask out loud. If you want to keep descending into those layers, subscribe now and stay close, because what comes next will take everything explored here and push it further into the territory that the builders of this world's systems have always feared the most. The territory where human beings remember who they actually are. That remembering starts here. It continues with you.